Sechte Dmai Parak Beis Mishnah Aleph. Ve'elu dvarim es asun Dmai b'chal makom. We learned in the previous parak that the chiyuv to take off ma'aser from the Dmai applies only to peiros that were grown in Eretz Yisrael within the boundaries of the area that were niskadesh by the Yidden who returned from Golos Bavel. Outside this area, the chiyuv of Dmai does not apply. One who buys produce of an Am Ha'aretz outside these boundaries may assume that the produce was grown locally and not imported from Eretz Yisrael. He therefore does not need to take ma'aser off these peiros. The Mishnah is going to list species of produce that are exceptions to this rule. The following types of produce must be ma'asered under the hilchos of Dmai in any area, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Hadvela, pressed figs, vatamorim, and dates, charuvin, carobs, oirez, is rice, and vahakamoin, and kumin. This applies to a superior variety of each one of these types of produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael and not elsewhere. The figs were incomparably sweet, the dates were extraordinarily large, the carobs were straight and beautiful, and the rice was extremely white. So such produce was obviously imported from Eretz Yisrael and is subject to the hilchos Dmai, even if it was purchased outside Eretz Yisrael. Ha'oirez shebechutz la'aretz, as far as rice that was grown outside of Eretz Yisrael is concerned, although produce that grows outside Eretz Yisrael is not subject to hilchos Dmai, the Chachamim made a gzeira that produce imported to Eretz Yisrael is mechuyev and Dmai. It's like once it goes over the border, then it's mechuyev, like taxes almost. This was due to the concern that people might confuse such produce with produce that was grown in Eretz Yisrael, and the confusion will lead people to believe that even produce grown in Eretz Yisrael is not mechuyev in Dmai. In general, this would apply even to ordinary varieties of that species of produce listed above, like regular pressed figs, or regular dates, or regular carobs. They are subject to the hilchos Dmai if they were imported to Eretz Yisrael and are being sold by an Am Ha'aretz, because aside from the high quality that grew only in Eretz Yisrael, the ordinary stuff that was found elsewhere also grew in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, by looking at the ordinary produce, there would be no way to tell whether it grew in Eretz Yisrael or not. So there's an exception to this rule, that oirez shebechutz la'aretz, as far as rice that's grown outside of Eretz Yisrael is concerned, kol mishtamish mimenu pater, whoever uses it, even inside Eretz Yisrael, is pater from ma'aser, meaning pater from Dmai, because this kind of rice that grows outside Eretz Yisrael looks different than the rice that grows in Eretz Yisrael, and there's no concern that people will confuse the two and end up eating rice grown in Eretz Yisrael without taking off ma'aser. For this reason, the Rabbanon did not include rice in the Gzeira requiring that produce imported to Eretz Yisrael be gemaisered as Dmai. Rice is the only species that can be recognized as having grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, since this variety of rice grown outside of Eretz Yisrael was not grown in Eretz Yisrael at all. Therefore, it's parted from the Dmai obligation in Eretz Yisrael if it was imported to Eretz Yisrael. Mishnah Beis. Hamakabel lovely Neman, somebody who wishes to accept upon himself the required standard of conduct to be trusted that his produce will not be considered Dmai, must accept to do the following. So the Mishnah is going to describe the standard of conduct that must be accepted by someone who wishes to join the ranks of those who are trusted when claiming that their peiros were gemaisert. So he must make this commitment publicly in front of three people. Once witness has testified that he's keeping his commitment, he'll be trusted that he takes meiser off his peiros. So ma'aser eshuhu eichel, he must accept upon himself to take off meiser from that which he eats, including Dmai, and he must commit to take off meiser even produce that's not definite tevel, but was purchased from Am Ha'aretz and thus subject to the Dmai obligation. So ma'aser eshuhu eichel, he has to take off meiser from what he eats, veshuh moicher, and that which he grows and sells. Generally, such produce is definite tevel, and you have to take off meiser before it's sold. And also anything that he buys from Am Ha'aretz and then resells, he needs to take off meiser from that also. Well, depending on the situation, it's often also to sell them even to people who are nema to take off meiser before eating it, and it's always forbidden to sell them to Am Ha'aretz. Someone who wishes to be considered trustworthy must follow these hilchos Dmai. He must also accept not to be the guest of Am Ha'aretz for a meal, because his host's food is Dmai. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says, even someone who joins an Am Ha'aretz as a guest is trusted. Rabbi Yehuda holds that while this person may feel a social obligation to eat together with his friend who's an Am Ha'aretz, he's still careful to take meiser of his own produce. Amrulai. So the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yehuda, if he's not trusted with himself, since he himself eats food that's Dmai at the house of Amaretz, how can he be trusted regarding what he sells to others? Since he's not careful himself to keep all the Hilchas Maisrus and Hilchas Dmai, the produce that he sells must be considered Dmai. The food that he's going to be eating by the Amaretz's house is produce and food that no Maisrus was taken off of. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the person who's trying to become Naman over here doesn't lose his Namanus over here at all. But the halach is not like Rabbi Yehuda, the halach would be like the Tanakama. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. Hamakabla lov liyos chaver. Having described in the previous Mishnah what a person needs to do in order to be trusted from Maisrus, the Mishnah goes on to a related subject and teaches something with a little more chumras. Somebody wishes to become a chaver, meaning a trustworthy person regarding taharas. So a chaver is a friend. The Rambam explains that the term chaver actually refers to Talmidei Chachamim and suggests that this is because they share a fellowship with one another, and that is the service of Hashem and the Asik about Torah. This term was applied to those who follow the practices described in the Mishnah because they were generally Talmidei Chachamim. Ordinary people were generally not knowledgeable about all the complex details of Tumah and Tara. Therefore, they were not trusted regarding Taras. For the same reason, we must assume that they and their family members, as well as their household items, are Tameh. So in order to be considered trustworthy regarding Taharas, a person must demonstrate special care with these laws. Thus, the basic requirements to become a chaver is that a person must commit to eat chulin, which is food that's not kadosh, only if it's tahar, even though it's not mechuyev min Torah. The Chazon Ish and the Mishnah Rishona speak out over here that taharas may be eaten only if they're tahar. This is not required for chulin. A chaver, however, must be careful that even the chulin he eats is tahar. A chaver must also fulfill the requirements to be trustworthy with respect to meiser, meaning that you could only become a chaver once you became a neman. If you're not neman, then you can't become a chaver. The Mishnah lists additional practices that he must accept upon himself. The first set of practices pertains to tumah of foods. Foods do not become tameh unless they were first prepared, susceptible to be mekabel tumah, until they were hochsher to be mekabel tumah by becoming wet with one of the 7 specific liquids, as mentioned in Machshirin, which would be yayin, dvash, chalav, tal, dam, and mayim. So once they become wet, even if they dried afterwards, they may become tameh only when touched by someone or something that is tameh. So mekabel lovely as chaver, someone who accepts upon himself to be a chaver, must keep the following. He must make these commitments in front of 3 chaverim, and then he undergoes a trial period of 30 days to practice them. If he successfully completes this, he's considered a chaver. So it's like a mamish has to take a test. He must not sell any food to Amaretz, whether it's wet or dry. And the reason for this is that Amaretz, who's considered tameh, makes food tameh when he touches it, and it's forbidden to cause tumah to food of Eretz Yisrael, even if it's chulin. Food of Eretz Yisrael that was once wet may not be given to an Amaretz, since he will likely cause it to become tameh by touching it, which is forbidden. Additionally, even if the food was always dry and therefore will not become tameh at this point, it is also to sell to an Amaretz because it will likely become wet at some point, because he's not zohir. The Amaretz is not careful and will cause it to become tameh. According to our Mishnah, it's forbidden to cause tumah even to chulin of Eretz Yisrael. The halacha is not like this, and in fact, it's mutter to cause tumah to chulin, but a person has to be extra careful. And this the Gemara Gittin and Daf Samachalov speaks out very clearly different ways, different tricks that you could do to prevent the food that's not chulin, whether it's challah, whether it's truma, or whether it's things that you're going to take off challah and truma from, to make sure that they don't become tameh. Also must not buy from an Amaretz food that was once wet, because we assume that the Amaretz has made it tameh. As mentioned before, a chaver does not eat tameh food, therefore a chaver may not buy food from Amaretz if the food was once wet, since it's possible that it became tameh. Even if the Amaretz claims that it's not tameh, we don't trust him because he's not an expert in the complexities of tumah v'tara. However, if the food is dry and the Amaretz says that it was never wet, he is believed. So again, there will be things that the Amaretz will be neman for and things that he won't, and the Mishnah will be clear when we do and when we don't. He must not be a guest in the house of Amaretz, since he may end up becoming tameh over there. Someone who enters the house of Amaretz will likely become tameh by unknowingly touching one of the many tameh items there, will end up making his own food tameh when he touches his own food. Therefore, a chaver may not visit the house of Amaretz even if he doesn't eat there. A person who wishes to become trustworthy regarding Maisrus, however, may visit the house of Amaretz as long as he doesn't eat there, as mentioned in Mishnah Beis. Nor may he have an Am Ha'aretz as a guest when the Am Ha'aretz is wearing his own clothing, since the host may become Tameh by touching the clothing of an Am Ha'aretz. The clothing of an Am Ha'aretz is Tameh Midrabanon. Therefore, a Chaver may not have an Am Ha'aretz who's wearing his own clothing as a guest, because the Chaver might touch his clothing and become Tameh. However, if the Chaver lends clothing to the Am Ha'aretz, the Chaver may have him as a guest. Although the Am Ha'aretz himself is Tameh, it's easier for the Chaver to avoid touching his body than his clothing. In each of these cases, we're concerned that the person might become Tameh without realizing it and then touch food and make it Tameh. Rabbi Yehuda adds on conditions to what the Tanna Kama said. You also must not raise small domestic animals such as sheep and goats in Eretz Yisrael. The Chachamim asked raising small domestic animals in Eretz Yisrael because these animals tend to wander off and graze unlawfully in other people's fields. Think of Avraham Avinu and Lot. You must not freely vow or act with lightheadedness, because a person who takes many vows will likely transgress some of them. And Schaik and Kalas Reish will lead, like the Mishnah says in Avos, because it's Margilin Esa Adam La'erva, could cause a person to immoral things. He also must be careful not to allow himself to become Tameh through the contact of Mesim. Generally, there's no Isser for a Chaver to become Tameh because he can easily purify himself by being Tayvel in a mikvah. However, he must avoid Tumas Meis, because only the Efer Para Aduma can purify him from this Tumah, and this Efer Tumah, the Efer Para Aduma, is not available. This prohibits only unnecessary contact with the dead body. However, when it's necessary, when participating in a funeral, it is permitted. So a person shouldn't think that he doesn't have to go to the Levaya because he's a Chaver. Mashamish v'Beis Medrash, he must study by the Talmidei Chachamim in the Beis Medrash, meaning he must study under them. Meaning, just like we said before from the Rav, that he has the 30-day period of when he needs to test out his Chavros, so too he needs to study under the Talmidei Chachamim to know practically the Hilchos Tumah V'Tara. These things are not included since they're unrelated to Tumah, therefore he can qualify to be a Chaver even without accepting these additional commitments. Although the requirement for a Chaver is to avoid Tumah through contact with the dead, obviously does involve Tumah. The Chachamim maintained that in the times of the Mishnah, the Efa Para was sufficiently available and would not be too difficult for a person to be Matar himself, even B'Tumas Meis or Efa Para. According to Rabbi Yehuda, however, someone who keeps the halachas of a chaver must keep these practices as well, which would be much more chomor than what the Tanna Kama would hold. Mishnah Dalet. Generally, it's the obligation of the person who wishes to eat produce to separate trumas and maasros before. And nevertheless, the Chachamim were geyser as a general rule that somebody who's selling produce that is tevel and must separate trumas and maasros before selling it. So in order to ensure that the bar doesn't end up eating paris that maasros wasn't taken off, so the one who's selling it has to take off all the zachin before. So regarding Dmai, however, it's not always required. In certain cases, the Chachamim required the seller to take off maasros, while in other cases they allowed him to sell produce that is Dmai. Let's say a person who's trusted with to separate maasros, he's going to always take off maasros regardless of whether the seller took off maasros or not. And they require the buyer to take maasros from the produce. This Mishnah discusses when the obligation to take Dmai is the seller's responsibility and when it's the buyer's responsibility. I think from this point on in the Masechta, we're just going to say he's mechuyev in Dmai. Mechuyev in Dmai will mean that he's mechuyev to be mafresh meiser from these payers. So commercial bakers, nachtaimim, so these commercial bakers who themselves are nemonim regarding meisers, but bought grain from which they bake their bread from Amhei Aretz, so they're required midrabanon to separate from the dough only the amount that fulfills the requirements of Trumas, Meiser, and Challah. In those days, the government officials overseeing the market would force bakers to sell their bread at unreasonably low prices. As a result, the bakers earned only a small profit on the bread that they sold. Look at Gittin on Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph. Since requiring them to separate Meiser Sheni would impose yet another burden on the bakers by putting them to the trouble of taking it up to Yerushalayim and eating it here, the Chachamim were makel regarding Meiser Sheni and didn't require them to separate it from grain of Demai, which they baked from their bread. Instead, they transferred this obligation to the person who buys the bread. Nevertheless, the bakers were required to separate Trumas Meiser since this does not involve any extra cost, and the additional cost is only 100th of the total amount. So the bakers are certainly mechuyev in the other Meisers that apply to the Dmai, like Meiser Rishon and other years Meiser Oni. Since those Meisers are merely designated and kept by the owner, you don't even have to give it to a Levi or to the Oni, therefore there's no effort or expense involved. The reason why the baker must separate Challah has nothing to do with the Hilchas Dmai and with whether the person from with whom he bought the grain is trusted or not. I mean, challah is a separate cheshbon over here. Rather, the baker must separate challah because the obligation to separate challah does not take hold till the flour is mixed with water, and the challah may not be separated earlier. Therefore, even if the baker buys the grain from someone who's not Am Haaretz, in which case the baker would not be mechuyev to take off meiser, he would still be mechuyev to be mafresh challah. So these people are required to remove Trumas Meiser and Challah. Since these bakers made only a very small profit, the Chacham didn't wish to burden them to transport the Meiser Sheni of the bread or this redemption money, which again would be very little to Yerushalayim. Therefore, they did not require them to separate Meiser Sheni before selling their bread to somebody who's trusted regarding Meiser. However, if they sold it to an Am Haaretz, they are required to separate Meiser Sheni as well. Retail shopkeepers who sell in small quantities and profit considerably it's also for them to sell the mai without first separating meisers, including meiser sheni. Since they made a large profit, the chachamim were mechayev them to separate meisers as well. All those who sell in large measures, meaning that they sell large quantities at once, are permitted to sell meiser. Are permitted to sell Dmai without taking off Meiser, that are not required to take off any Meiser whatsoever. Since those who sell in large quantities typically measure generously, limiting their profits, therefore the Chachamim made the buyer responsible to take off Meiser. Elohina mashpim b'mida gasa, who are those who sell with large measure, who are therefore potter from Meiser? Wholesalers and grain sellers. That is, not only are large scale wholesalers who buy grain and farmers and sell it to shopkeepers permitted to sell Dmai, but even private grain sellers who also sell in bulk may do so. Right? That would be sitoinos, or wholesalers. Okay. Mishnah Hey. Remei Remer Shedarka Liv Moded Bagasa Moded Bedaka Tzfela Daka Lagasa. What are we talking about over here? So we just mentioned in the previous Mishnah that Dmai sold in large amounts. The buyer has to take off Meiser, while Dmai sold in small amounts, the seller has to take off Meiser. So the Mishnah is going to elaborate on this halacha, beginning with the discussion regarding a seller who's selling produce with a different measure from that which is normally used. There are different nuschos in the Mishnah, but we're going to follow specifically the nusach of the Rambam over here. So Rameir says that Shadarki l'moda bagasa moda de bedaka tfeila daka lagasa. So if you usually measure with a large measure, produce that's usually sold in large amounts such as wheat, when in this case measure with a small measure, only a small amount was sold. So tfeila daka lagasa, small measure is insignificant relative to the large one, and is considered as if the sale was done with a large measure. This is because we follow the usual rather than the actual manner of the sale. Since this product is usually sold in large amounts, the law is determined based on the rule applying to large amounts. Thus, the buyer is required to separate meisers. The reason why the chachamim were mechayev somebody who sells a small amount of dmai to take meiser off of it, because the seller makes significant profit on the sale. This reason would seem to apply whenever he sells a small amount, even if the product is usually sold in larger amounts. Nevertheless, the Rabbanon generally made their decrees as an absolute rule, as a loy plug, and did not differentiate whether the reason for the decree applies in the particular case or not. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches that we follow the usual manner of sale and not how much is actually sold because of a loy plug. But let's say you usually measure with a small measure, but was in this case measured with a large measure, a large amount of sold. The large measure is insignificant relative to the small one, as considered as if the sale was done with a small measure. Therefore, the seller is required to take off meiser as if he were selling a small amount. So here too we follow the usual rather than the actual manner of the sale. What's considered a large measure? For dry food, for salads, 3 kav, which would be the measure equal to the volume of 24 eggs, 2 dozen eggs, which is not too small. Ubalach, dinner. For liquid, it's the amount that can be purchased with a dinner, this measure is given in terms of price rather than volume, because liquids would constantly go up and down in price due to the difficulty involved in transporting large amounts of liquid from one place to another. Therefore, liquids would be sold by price, a dinar's worth of liquids, rather than by volume. Rabbi Yosi says, "Salei te'enim v'salei anav v'kupish shel yarek kol zman shu meichern achzera poter." Rabbi Yosi says that regarding baskets of figs, baskets of grapes, and boxes of vegetables, as long as he sells them by estimation without weighing, measuring, or counting their contents, he's exempt from Dmai requirements at all. So achzera means oimid, which means lei b'midav lei b'mishkal alufi oimid. An estimate, he's going to be poter because it's considered as if he's selling begasa. Because Rabbi Yossi maintains that when produce is sold by estimation, the seller will need to add extra produce, reducing his profit. Therefore, the seller is exempt from Demai as well as when he sells from a large amount. According to the Rambam and the Rav, the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Yossi and hold that the seller is mechuyev to take off Demai, and he sells by estimate in small amounts.